Friends, and welcome to this session of Authors Talk. And we have Dr. John Clemmer, professor in Jindal School of Liberal Arts and Humanities, who has authored his recent Cultural Rights and Justice, published by Parker Macmillan, and followed by panel discussion. And we are very fortunate to have Professor C. Vishwanathan from JSGP and Dr. R. Krishnaswamy from JSLH to talk about the book. Let me introduce the author, John Clemmer. He's Professor of Sociology in the School of Liberal Arts and Humanities and in the Jindal Global Law School at Jindal Global University. He was previously Professor of Development Sociology at the United Nations University, Tokyo, and prior to that, Professor of Comparative Sociology at Sophia University of Tokyo. He has held titular positions at the University of Hull, UK, and the National University of Singapore, and has held visiting positions at Oxford University, the University of Kent, Murdoch University, and the Australian National University. He is the author of 17 books, including the Parker Macmillan volume Cultures of Transitions and Sustainability. With this, I welcome you again, and hopefully we'll have a very fruitful discussion about the book. So I invite Professor Clemmer to talk about his books and the subject therein. Thank you.
It's still working. Thank you very much to the library for organizing the book talk. I think a few more people are on the way, but we'll start anyway. And to my two commentators for taking time out of their busy schedule to come. And it's very gratifying for the library to invite us. I know one or two of us have spoken here before on a new book, and a nice kind of way of launching it. The copy of the book is there. You'll see the picture of what it looks like on the screen anyway, but there are some real copies here if anyone wants to get the actual book itself. The book, as you can see, is called Cultural Rights and Justice, and it emerges out of a much longer project which goes back, not a decade, but getting close to that. Time flies, isn't it? Huh? Which was really to do with the subject of what I suppose we would basically call culture and development. I know the word development is loaded with all sorts of ideological meanings. It's not a very satisfactory word, but people on the whole don't seem to be able to come up with a very good alternative to this. I've worked in development sociology most of my career, but I've always been a fairly kind of interdisciplinary person myself. I hope my dean shows up. She loves that word. Okay. And meaning that although the conventional approaches to a lot of development studies, of course, have been largely economic in nature, others perhaps more political, there's been the field of sociology of development itself, but has oddly enough rarely penetrated to the question of the role of culture development. What I mean by that is that a lot of the sociological work on development is dealt with social structures, dealt with other important questions, caste, of gender, and so on, the classical kind of divisions of sociological discourse, without ever actually addressing what I would consider to be culture itself. I'll give you one example. I won't mention their names. The book's in the library here. There's quite a well-established textbook on the subject. It's called Culture and Development. Okay, published by a very distinguished publisher, two Australian authors, and it's quite an interesting book because in about 250 pages they managed not to mention culture once, which is rather interesting, because they do not mention the actual cultural life that goes past it, whether that's defined in terms of the arts, in terms of literature, in terms of theatre, in terms of performance, in terms of any of these kind of issues are absent. And this struck me way back as being a glaring hole in the whole discourse, one of which I then started to try and fill up, because coming from a background not only in sociology but also in social anthropology, which inevitably involves obviously the discussion of culture as this kind of, in a sense, central concept, how to put these things together. So I started on a project which is actually produced, I'm glad to say, four books now. This is the latest in a sort of series. Not in a planned sense of writing, a whole series, one relating to the other, but each one of which addressed an aspect of this. The first one was a book, in fact, which really specifically addressed the question of culture and development. And what, in my view, was missing from the kind of discourse about that theme, and how those themes might be reintroduced into the way in which we talk about development issues. It also addressed some of the questions which development sociologists have struggled with for some time, including issues of why so many development projects fail. You can learn a lot from the failures, obviously, by finding out what was missing. Why did what appeared to be on paper a very satisfactory project, delivering health, delivering all sorts of issues, not always worked in the way in which they were hoped to by the people who conceived them. In fact, I was very happy yesterday to see the names of the two people who just won the Nobel Prize in economics, because they are to a great extent an exception to this. I mean, there are people who've done detailed work, including detailed field work, on actual conditions of poverty. And that's very different from thinking about this as a purely kind of theoretical subject to which you can, if you put in more money, the problem gets solved and all this kind of thing. Anybody who experiences this kind of field, of course, knows it's never that simple. It's much more complex. And the complexity often lies in the question of culture itself. Okay? How people respond to a development policy, how they will react to all sorts of things. And this is not, by the way, necessarily true only of so-called, I don't like that word, but underdeveloped societies. It can be true of many societies. I remember once giving a very interesting little seminar, I used to live in Japan, for a hospital in Tokyo, where the medical director asked me to come and run a seminar for the nursing staff, because they were getting more foreign patients. And they couldn't understand why certain of those foreign patients, it wasn't necessarily just a question of language, would refuse certain foods, for example, or would refuse to see a doctor of the opposite gender, right? Or would be very unhappy about certain medical procedures like blood transfusions. They well, why? I mean, we're in hospital, all the best technical stuff is here. It became quite clear that the issue they were dealing with was at another level a question of culture, right? And that is therefore, I think, rather general. So having kind of opened up that subject with the first of the books in the series, which was about essentially culture and development itself, that led me to a second one, which was, well, amongst these sort of missing areas, which ones would be really worth pursuing in more detail? And in that second book, the issue I took up was the arts, very specifically, the role of the arts in development. Not only in the way in which they are, in fact, part of the way in which, from an instrumental point of view, development policies are often delivered, as it were. In fact, if you go to Bengal, I mean, some of you are from Bengal, you will find very quickly that theatre has been a very important mechanism it's all over India, but Bengal seems to be the heartland of the way in which theatre, applied theatre, or sometimes what is called third theatre, has been actively used to persuade people who may not be very literate, who are not necessarily responsive to kind of verbal or written propaganda, especially written propaganda if they're illiterate, right? Is a way of delivering messages, whatever it's about, water, AIDS, health issues, child rearing, a number of things, in ways which are far more effective than the traditional means of delivery, and seem to have quite a high success rate in the sense of opening people's minds up to the way in which a development policy might be accepted, not because they're simply told it's a good thing, but precisely because it can be shown to be with an interface with their cultural expectations and needs. And many, many examples of this exist. Okay? And that again takes us back probably to some extent to this question of development failures. Why in many cases projects don't work? It's because they've missed out on that dimension. A number of people have started to talk about not the development of culture, or rather, of the cultural development, but the development of culture. If you go to any of the major funding agencies that I'm aware of and ask them for money for a health project, maybe water, sanitation, something like this, they're quite likely to give you the money. If you don't believe me, try this yourself. Go and ask for some money to promote theatre, to promote arts in whatever form, whether it be visual art, painting, film, theatre, drama of some kind, and you will find that very, very few are willing to give you anything because they don't consider this to be particularly relevant to the development project. Whereas, of course, what I'm arguing here is that it's central. It's central. Not only is a vehicle for getting other things done, but because if you ask questions about the good life, which, as far as I'm concerned, would be the ultimate goal of development, however defined, okay, those elements would be part of how we would define our good life, I assume. If not, we can argue about it afterwards, right? No, it's these things. Good life is not just defined in economic terms, for example, more wealth rather than something else. I remember when I was a student of anthropology coming across a brilliant example of this by an Australian anthropologist called R.F. Salisbury, who'd worked in New Guinea at the time when what is now Papua New Guinea was still an Australian protectorate. And if you've ever been there, you'll know it's a very wild place. The main road from Port Moresby, the capital, runs for about 20 kilometres, and that's the end. After that, you have to walk, take a canoe, or take a helicopter or something. You know, it's still quite wild country. Amongst the peoples of the interior were peoples who were essentially with stone tools. And I remember once taking an archaeology class, and one of the things we did as a kind of practical element was make stone tools. If you like to try this at home, it's quite fun, but you're going to damage your hands, right? And you know what happens? Just when you've got your spear point just ready, just one more blow with my big rock, it breaks. And you have to start the whole process again and do it again. Anyway, if you try and cut down a tree with a stone axe, after a dozen or so blows, your axe is blunt. You have to sharpen it. The idea of his team was simply to, as an aid project, to equip people with steel tools, so that they could greatly increase their agricultural productivity much more efficiently than using their basically stone-based technology. Now, you can probably guess there's a sting in the tail to this story. When the project was evaluated, a year or 18 months later, it was discovered that they were producing exactly the same amount, which drives economists crazy, right? They're supposed to maximize, right? We've given you the technology to do this. Even with a simple technology, you could make more. They were not doing this. When they were asked, the answers to this lack of increased productivity were two things to be familiar to a lot of anthropologists. One was they didn't want social inequalities to emerge in their society. And they found that some people would be more energetic at using the new technology, would essentially produce more, would become richer, and they didn't want that to happen. Quite apart from the fact, as they rightly pointed out, without refrigeration, it's hard to keep big surpluses free of the bugs and rats and so on. So there's no point in having a big surplus anyway, okay? The second reason was the one that I really loved. So what do you do with the extra time? You're producing the same amount in a third or a quarter of the time. You know what their answer was? Dancing. What they really loved was dancing. So now they had a lot more free time to dance. And by the way, this is not a unique story. I came across a very interesting newspaper report last year when a school in a very poor area of Goa, which you don't think of being a particularly underdeveloped part of India, right? The children in the school were asked what they would like. There were some funds for something. They wanted, better desks or something like this. They wanted better whatever, more books. Their answer was very interesting. It was a theatre. They wanted a performance space so that they could produce stuff, okay, whether other people's plays or their own. And I thought that was, again, an answer which fits rather into this kind of category that we're talking about. There are many, many examples of this kind of phenomenon. Okay, it was to bring the arts back into the question of development. The third stage of this project was to raise a third kind of question, which is, you look around the world, it's pretty obvious that we have a kind of planetary crisis, right? Ecologically, socially, pollution, loss of biodiversity, that whole depressing list of issues that tragically we're all very familiar with. We're supposed to be a fairly smart species, right? We can get people to the moon. Well, India had some trouble getting their things to land on the moon, right? Probably, but we can put people on the moon, and we don't seem, in many cases, to be able to address these fundamental social questions that surround us. The question then was, if you wanted to define a sustainable culture, and obviously in the long run, any culture to be sustainable has to match itself to ecological and other conditions, right? What is it in our culture, what is it in our civilization that leads us to mess up in this dramatic way when we should have the intelligence to be able to figure out fairly rational solutions and to be able to apply them, okay? So that led me to the book in question you see before us, okay? And I'll unleash my commentary. So, where does this fit into the project? In several ways, 2 or 3 in particular. The first was the notion of cultural rights. Obviously, the notion of human rights is very familiar to all of us, okay? Increasingly, people are beginning to talk about the idea of extending the notion of human rights as a sort of individual thing to the notions of cultures themselves, on the basis of several arguments. One of those arguments is simply, the value of cultures. Well, why should they be allowed to erode or disappear? The second has a lot actually to do with indeed issues like sustainability and ecology. Embodied in cultures, of course, is huge amounts of traditional wisdom, often of an ecological kind, and this kind of stuff. Leading, in fact, to the argument that the maintenance of cultural diversity is as important to our long-term survival as is the maintenance of biodiversity. In fact, they're related. Because if you look at the languages and cultures of many so-called simpler societies, okay, what you'll find embedded in their languages and cultures, of course, is a huge amount of ecological wisdom. They've sustained themselves very satisfactorily over very long periods of time. There's clearly a lot of wisdom embodied in their culture. With the loss of their languages in particular, and language loss is a major problem globally, right? Language disappearing at a terrifying rate, okay? With the loss of those languages is, of course, lost the wisdom which was embodied in those languages, okay? So it's possible, I think, to make a fairly sound argument that the maintenance of cultural diversity in the face of the pressures that cultures undergo at the moment, whether it's globalization, whether it's any of these kind of things, the kind of homogenization of culture, the so-called McDonaldization of culture, is in fact to keep cultures alive, to find strategies to support cultural diversity, not simply to allow this kind of erosion to take place as a sort of natural process. Obviously, historically, cultures have come and gone, right? Cultures don't last forever. Nevertheless, we seem to be in a period at the moment not only of extreme biodiversity loss, but also of cultural loss. If you raise that as the kind of central question I tried to do in the book we're discussing today, that itself raises a number of, I think, interesting questions about how you try to incorporate or reincorporate into cultural discourse the kinds of cultural dimensions that we've been talking about. And those are a number of kinds. I won't bore you with details about, if you buy the book, I'll autograph it for you, so it'll be very valuable one day if I win a Nobel Prize in something, okay? Which is pretty unlikely at this stage of life, but anyway, just in case, okay? Let me just take one example from the book, because the book discusses a number of other things which have not yet appeared very much in central development studies, and this is the point, in a way, of the book. Why in development studies, particularly development sociology, a certain limited discourses has appeared. And outside that box, people often don't consider issues which I think, and I've tried to argue in the book, should be inside the box. One of those, of course, is the general issue of culture itself. That includes the things we've just been talking about, the arts and other issues. But let me just take one issue which is discussed in the book. One of the kind of growth areas in cultural studies and in sociology past decade has been the sociology of the body. What's body's got to do with development? Okay, well, a lot, okay? Because, of course, the way in which processes of development act on us as human beings is profoundly bodily in its nature. Whether this is changes in diet, changes in dress, changes in work expectations, any of these things, our concept of time, right? The way we work, any of these things are implicated in that notion. There was one particular theme which seemed to illustrate this very much. Some years ago, I worked with refugee communities. And one of the things very much missing from the kind of more academic literature on refugees is what, this may sound ridiculous, okay, what it's actually like to be a refugee in terms of your daily bodily experience. And furthermore, what is it like to be an old refugee as opposed to a young one, a female refugee as opposed to a male one, child refugee as opposed to an adult one? And when you ask those questions, immediately these are the things that people begin to express. Okay? They can take many, many forms. Again, whether it's access to kind of medical care or something like this, or things as simple as proximity, living in proximity with people of a different age, a different gender, or a different culture, or a different tribe. I was at the University of Papua New Guinea once, and I was told that the room I was staying in was very safe because crime was incredibly high. And somebody said to me, you know, one of the major problems we have in the dorms, I think we don't have this at Jindal, hopefully, was tribal fighting. You know, you shared a room with someone and you met him on the first day in class, and where are you from? And he mentioned his tribe, and you thought, my God, you know, my hereditary enemy, right? And people would quite literally reach for their clubs or spears or whatever they had, right? You know, I'm not going to share the room with you, right? You know, they would assault one another, okay? So once you raise those questions, whether it's the proximity of sanitation, of access to food, of access to bathing facilities, any of those things, those issues which to some extent have been discussed in the context of the sociology of the body have not been discussed in the context of the sociology of development. So one of the major thrusts of the book is in fact to create dialogue between subjects which I think are highly relevant to the study of development, which are so far laid outside the main discourse. And if the book's successful at all, I hope it will in fact introduce those themes back into where we talk about these issues. So thank you very much. So I probably talked far too long, so now let me pass the mic, one of the mics to where am I?
Thank you. Thanks a lot, John, for asking me to comment on your book. It was really, I really enjoyed the book. Now, I'm not an anthropologist or a sociologist, but I will still talk about it from a philosophical perspective if I can. Now, culture is generally sometimes overused word, but whatever it is, and I think the relevance the role of culture within society, whatever the implicit interpretation that people give to it, has always had center stage in any kind of social and political discussion. Now, but I think, so a lot of people start with the assumption, which is, I think is right, which is that whatever culture is, the more the merrier. So we need diversity, and I think that's something that John also talks about, which is, so a lot of people start backwards, start from diversity, and then try and understand what culture can be. Now, on this problem of diversity, or how much we need diversity and how to establish diversity, has has had a lot of philosophers and anthropologists, and I want to talk about philosophers now, a lot of political philosophers trying to justify the relevance of cultural rights, cultural justice, things that John is talking about. But one of a big lacuna in the discussion is that they talk about cultural rights without much talking about how they understand culture, without having the need to understand what it is to be part of a lived community and so on. So it's always outside in rather than inside out. And I think what is so refreshing about this book, which talks about cultural rights, is that it talks a lot about culture and gives a lot of examples about different cultures that have existed and do exist in the world. Now, and I think what is very central to John's claim, I think he talks about it as he juxtaposes human rights and cultural rights, and he talks about something like something called holistic rights, and I think that is something that's very, very interesting. Now, how does he situate holistic rights? What is very central, and I think this debate again is a perennial debate about how to bridge the gap between different cultures, right? So if we have different diverse cultures, how do I go about having a society in which we have more cultures, but as well as differences which don't lead to insurmountable conflict. Now that as a political issue is also, I think, what John is also talking about. And I think what is central to his claim, unlike other political theorists that I know, is that he says that what makes culture viable, or diverse culture viable, is its responsible relation to the environment. And I think he calls it ecological rights, he calls it deep ecology. But I think this idea that you need to have a responsible relation to your environment is, and he calls it cultural responsibility as well. I think so. This responsibility towards your environment should be one of the defining characteristics of any culture. And it is not only a normative claim that he's making, but is also a slightly descriptive statement in the sense that as he reviews the different cultures that have existed, he finds that many of the cultures which have, so to speak, stood this test of time have expressed themselves through a kind of a symbiotic relation between their cultural expression and the environment that they exist in. So this dichotomy between the environment and the society of which it is a part is something that doesn't exist in any form of culture. And I think so. So he's juxtaposing this kind of understanding of culture vis-a-vis the later capitalist interpretation of culture as something that tries to create a wedge between your responsibility to human beings versus your responsibility to nature. And I think he feels that in modernity, in modern times, because you've had a capitalist form of production, this wedge as to the duty of your nature has been completely ignored. So I think, and that's an interesting idea that I found, that your responsibility towards your nature is not necessarily antagonistic to your responsibility to your fellow human being. So this, I think, is, this is something that I think I agree with, and I think it's a great idea. And so what that means is that, so if all cultures are, or all fair and just cultures have a deep relation to its ecology, then what that means is that it is any kind of violation of, ecological responsibilities is injustice. So the role of any kind of, for want of a better word, any kind of a government which is either national or supranational should therefore be to try and embody these cultural rights, if at all possible, through institutions, whether in institutional form of mediation to bringing about culture or cultural rights is inherently contradictory or not is an open question, something that we could discuss in our discussion. But I think, so with this understanding of what culture is, then he goes on to talk about, then he goes on to substantive claims, at least substantive assumptions, which I endorse, regarding what culture can be. So he talks about cultural rights, and then he talks about what is culture, and I think that's what's the meaty part of the book, as far as I see it. And I think he understands culture, as he was just talking about, as something that is embodied in different performances, and so he looks at culture as not only an expression of the values of the community, but the method of its expression is something that is equally fundamental to what that culture is about. Generally, we have the idea that culture doesn't matter how it gets expressed, but as long as culture gets expressed in one way or the other, that is a good in itself. But for him, how it is mediated is an important element to culture itself. So therefore, and then he talks about, and to echo what he just said, he talks about how performances, the body, are all important factors when it comes to any kind of cultural expression. So, and I will try and wrap it up here. And I think this notion of cultural justice is something that is non-spatial, and I think that's, so when he talks about culture as being merely performative, then the links between different kinds of people need not necessarily be spatial. And I think we're used to thinking of culture in spatial terms, and you think of a community, you're thinking of an area in which the community lives. But if you expand the notion of culture into different kinds of performative associations that people might have, then it means that globalization is compatible with cultural diversity. And generally, it's understood that globalization is a kind of negates different differences and diversity. But I think if you remove this assumption that culture has got to be tied to a particular location and a particular group of people that you associate with, then the movement of people somehow, and that's what globalization is, movement of people somehow negates the preservation of that culture. But I think what John is trying to say is that if we think of culture in a slightly different way, it's possible for culture and globalization to exist together, and he talks about it as cultural globalization. And I think we talk about culture, globalization is the movement of capital, but it also, and also people, but movement of people means also movement of culture. So you have a kind of a very fluid concept of culture, which is more representative of actual facts than what we're used to understanding as a monolithic entity which is tied to a particular group of people in a particular place and time. Now, so I think by removing all these assumptions that a lot of people come to when they talk about cultural light, I think he's opened up a great field for, again, talking about cultural lights in an important and relevant way and not in a kind of a trite way. So for that, I should really thank him, and I think I really enjoyed reading the book. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I read the book twice. And I think there was a gap of a few days in between when I went off to the Sebastian Kappen Symposium and came back. And I discovered that the book I had was actually very different from the one I had read. So let me begin with the first book. I think what's really fascinating is the way John brings culture back, philosophically and as a storyteller. You know, it reminded me of something. Years ago, we had the standard magic thing, that when I hear the word culture, I reach for my gun. And I think Alexander Gerschenkron, the Princeton historian, once said that every time I hear the guns, I reach for my culture. I think the beauty of John's book is every time he hears the word development, he reaches for the culture. And I think that one act, he does something fascinating. As someone who has suffered 10 years of UNU also, there are certain questions. John's book, if it's read linearly, is very affable. It accommodates all kinds of arguments within the same frame. But if I were to read it structurally, in a very quiet way, this is one of the most quarrelsome books ever written. Let me just take some words and analyze it for you. Sustainability. You know, I remember a Jesuit ethicist recently told me that there are two words India could do without: corporate social responsibility and sustainable development. He said, I can't think of two greater oxymorons. The effort of John's book is actually to sustain what I call the oxymorons of the UN. And one is sustainable development. Everything in the book argues against sustainability as an idea. And yet he retains the term. Let me just take two aspects of it. For someone who spent so much time talking about cosmology, he hardly refers to epistemology. So what you have is the theory of the cosmos, your ontology, but for all the traditional wisdom that you refer to, you have no theory of knowledge. I mean, I'll just give you an example. About a few years back, I was working with the Dan tribals in Gujarat, and one of them came to me and said, "Will you have a seminar?" I said, "Sure, but why do you want me for a seminar?" He said, "No, we want a seminar on science." I said, "Yes." And then one of the tribal kids who had been to JNU also said, "I don't want a subaltern seminar." I said, this was getting really intriguing. And then I said, "What do you want?" He said, "I want to invite our witch doctors, our ojas, our healers to meet your Western doctors and psychiatrists. But I want a level ground for that. Can you give us epistemic equivalence so that my idea of cognition and your idea of cognition have an equality of standing?" Now, I don't think you can create a theory of diversity without an equality of epistemic standing. And I think that's one point that you ignore. Though there are nuggets throughout the book.
It's in the other books.
No, I know. Okay. But I think we must be careful here. Two, I think what's fascinating about your book is you talk about diversity, but you hardly mention time. And I think one of the debates we have had in India for years is, can you have rights to a multiplicity of time? In fact, this was fought out about 10 years ago with the Constitutional Reform Committee, where of course Venkata Chennai eventually told us, "You guys are too futuristic, come back in 10 years." But the question is, how do you sustain a tribe? How do you sustain a forest without a multiplicity of time? Because you speak in developmental time, or if you speak in linear time, you can't save the forest of the tribe. It needs a different vernacular. And for someone who emphasizes the vernacular notion of time and the idea of morality is short. And I tell you why this becomes important. In India, just by defining language as anything which has a script, we destroyed 2,000 languages in a day. And I think at one level, your defense of diversity is a defense of morality. Tacitly. To me, the tacit part of the book is fascinating. And I think that's where John really becomes a theorist of culture. Not in the overt, but in the covert part, the unstated part of culture. Almost the silences which you need to sustain cosmology, to sustain epistemology. In fact, if I read a book linearly, you sound like an affable Rotarian. If I read a book structuredly, you should have been arrested. Because I think the kind of rights you're talking about is very different and very potent. In fact, in a way, this book is the staging of the performance, the metaphor, the staging of the problematics of a performance. In fact, when you talked about theatre, I was reminded of my two old heroes, Badal Sarkar and of course, U.R. Anandamurthy. I do a lot of work with Kannada theatre, and one day, in fact, one of them came back and told me, "There's something you must know. Bertolt Brecht's Crime of Galileo has been performed more times in Malayalam than in German." I think, in a way, that's the kind of work we're talking about, which is not just of theatre or diversity, but of translation. And I wish we had spent more time in talking about the word translation. Because even your idea of globalism is actually planetary. I wish people would throw out the word global. Sorry, wrong place to say it. But I think global is parochial. Because the notions of time it incorporates, of speed, of obsolescence, actually doesn't talk about the ethical consciousness of a book, which, if you look at your theory of nature, you look at your theory of environment, is actually ethically planetary. So I've jumped global. Whether it's in Jindal global or any kind of global. I think let's be very clear. This is a parochial term. And I think it has problems. I think what's nice about you is You love to salvage standard social science. I wish you'd jump a few of them and ruthlessly, because that's the choice you have to make for cultural rights. What is the language of cultural rights? Can formal social science do it? And that is where I'm surprised by your appreciation of Amartya Sen and Mata Nazmor, who, as far as I'm concerned, are illiterate about rights. Sorry, I'm going back to the UNU debates in Finland between Bimal Matilal, Amartya Sen, Ashish Nandi, and the CSDS group. And I could tell you that Amartya has no idea of environment for years. He discovered environment, what, 30 years too late. Of course, he was offended that the younger generation of D-School told him that. But where is Amartya's understanding of environment? Zilch. I don't know how he got the Nobel. No, I think we have to ask serious questions here. I know at the end of the conference, in fact, Amartya got the seminar stopped because he found that he was being exposed. But I don't think he's so clear on rights. Because eventually what you get from him is the right to development, which is particularly the right you're questioning. So I think the politeness to some of the characters in the book distresses me. No, because then your niceness won't save rights. So I went back and took around all the concepts in your book, and I got a very different kind of narrative. Syllabus, cosmos, civilization, civics, citizenship. You're high on cosmology. But I think the way you still remain a Westerner is, I think you're low on diversity theory. If you look at most Western books, they're heavy on liberty and equality. But when they come to diversity, I think there's hardly any theory. It's just an appeal to difference. But how do you sustain an epistemology of differences, a dialogue of differences, a cosmology of differences? Because globalism is eventually the encounter between incompatible cultures. So I was fascinated by the questions of democracy that you raise. So at one level, I like your ethical concern for the margin. But I wish you'd abandon the social science, which treats the margin so objectively. And I think that's the ailment of you and me. It's something I've watched very closely for years. I think in trying to square the circle or save the phenomena of development, of sustainability, it's actually a threat to democracy. I'll just give you a word which you and you never uses in time: obsolescence. Or even the questions of displacement. I mean, a right to culture in India would mean a guarantee against the fact that over 60 million people have been displaced in India by dams. How do you incorporate this kind of violence? So I think it needs a return to what you come back to in the end. The return of the storyteller. I mean, suppose you were to take one story of one genocide or one violence and reflect it through your book. Would your book read differently? I think so. That's what I think.
Very briefly, well, thank you both very much for seeing things that probably I couldn't see in there, and suggesting things which could be in another version of it, or which in fact I think should have raised a very radical question, which I have talked about elsewhere, though actually not in this book, which is indeed what an alternative social science would look like if it were in fact reconceived on, I think, on the lines you're suggesting. You know, when people talk about, well, you know, cultural diversity, about, you know, translation and this kind of stuff, I think built in is an assumption in many cases that one of those views is right. If you take the more radical view that, in a sense, at least a priori, all worldviews are correct, and whether they appear to be compatible or not, that leads you to very radical conclusions about the nature of knowledge. And maybe I was assuming that rather than putting it in the book, because that seems to me a fundamentally interesting question. So when you're talking about abandoning social sciences, perhaps what you're implying is something a bit like that from diversity would emerge potentially very, very different ways of thinking about the world and culture, and that should be encouraged very much so. Would that be a right reading of your thought?
By the way, social science isn't very life-giving.
No, it's not, of course not. Yeah. So, with that thought, let me, yes.
It's actually, I'm afraid, more of a question for Shiv. I've not read the book. The point that you were raising about epistemic diversity and the equality of it, the need to understand my knowledge as equal to yours. How do we justify it or even accept it when chemotherapy is also cure for cancer as is drinking cow urine? Right? Can we consider that to be equal? I wouldn't. So, I mean, there are certain epistemology, certain systems of knowledge that have existed or are being in fact reimagined or recreated, but which ought to be contested. Whereas there are people who will have you believe that no, their systems of knowledge are as valid as anything else. So then, and this then does tie up, I think, with from what I understand to be there in John's book, but generally the notion of culture, and harks back to ideas of Western rationalism and how we problematize it definitely and question it. There are dimensions to it that are valid, but then how do we square it with this kind of traditional or sometimes pseudo-traditional knowledge that is also emerging and more so in our own time? Perhaps both of you then could reflect on it. There's a mic there also.
Actually, this question was answered 100 years ago. If you look at the Dialogue of Medicine's report on indigenous medicine, have you seen the Srinivas Murthy report? Srinivas Murthy was a great doctor. In fact, he was John Barrymore's doctor when John Barrymore was an alcoholic. He wrote the comments of the Committee for Indigenous Medicine. He developed an epistemological circle where contestation is to be accepted. Why is contestation denied in any equal system? You debate, you dialogue. And dialogue and debate demand contestation. So there's no need to sort of preserve traditional medicine. A lot of traditional medicine will survive. And in fact, this is why in the debates now, they've coined the concept of cognitive justice. That is the right of different forms of knowledge to coexist, provided they add to the livelihood and life. This debate has gone much further. So let's not get caught in the old stereotype that you're preserving some little nugget of traditional knowledge. In fact, it's very interesting in the debates, whether in South Africa or in India, marginal groups have in fact asked for open epistemic debates in science. They're not asking for preservation, they're not asking for museumization. Don't confuse the present regime, which is illiterate on epistemology and reduces epistemology to techniques like Ramdev, with the original debate that took place in India for 100 years throughout the Indian national movement, where it was about the epistemology of agriculture, there was the epistemology of technology, questions of debates about time. We have a rich heritage of history and philosophy of science for 100 years. Unfortunately, it's been obfuscated by one of the most illiterate regimes in current history, which neither knows history of science nor has any idea of the future. So let's be clear on that. There is tremendous literature. I can give you over 100 articles on it. And the same debate now is taking place in South Africa, where they in fact try to bring the idea of cognitive justice almost into a constitutional sentence. So you don't do it out of sentiment. You do it rationally. And why do you think rationality is the preoccupation of the West? I don't think so. Two, the idea of epistemic justice goes the other way. I'll give you an example. My friend Ziauddin Sadar argued it for the national health system. He said, as an English citizen, I am entitled to the national health system. But he said, as a Muslim, I am also entitled to my cosmologies and epistemologies of death, pain and dying. The question is, how do you reconcile the two? And there's some fascinating work on this kind of thing. So, I mean, let's not get caught. This is not fundamentalism, this is not traditionalism. This is as hard a philosophy of science as you want. I mean, we get caught in stereotypes. An example I'll give you is Gandhian Chakra. The Gandhian Chakra is not traditional. It's not even Indian first. It was designed by a Polish engineer, Friedman, who has over 100 electrical patents in Paris. There's nothing traditional about it. So let's not get caught in stereotypes about tradition. I think it had tremendous ideas of innovation. The question that, say, the national movement, people like Kumaraswamy asked was, how do you sustain these epistemes against the battle of obsolescence? So it's a different debate. And there's a stunning literature on it. In fact, very soon we might have about 4 volumes of archives on it, if you're interested.
I think you answered the question very well already. But just to add a couple of things, I mean, I think there are a number, I think part of the complexity of this is a number of issues mixed up with this, right? One is indeed this question of we start from the assumption of the quality of epistemological systems. You know, they're all a priori equal. But secondly, I mean, is the question then of critique? I mean, to what extent within or from outside the culture, anybody, and who has the authority, in a sense, to critique one of those epistemological settings? Because obviously, within a lot of the worldview we use ourselves, there are things that most of us would regard as seriously wrong. There is the need for critique as well, without that critique degenerating into some sort of ethnocentrism, which raises the whole question of dialogue. I mean, on what basis do you create dialogue between not incompatible systems, but different ones, in order to hopefully allow something to emerge from that dialogue, which was not in the original, kind of Hegelian thing in a way, right? It was not in the original position from which either of the actors started.
You've got it. John, I'm sorry I haven't read your book yet, but you said I could buy one and you'd sign it, so thank you very much. I will do that. Perhaps my question or my comment is irrelevant. And it is now, you know, the convention, the UNESCO Convention for the Preservation of Intangible Cultural Heritage is getting some attention and is getting some funding, not remarkable funding, from the EU and from different countries involved. When you read the definition, you read the areas of preservation. It goes everywhere from camembert to, Baal songs. It also covers areas that are very much, let's say, not symptoms, but examples of the dynamic culture, meaning things that are changing, that aren't preserved, although the term is preservation. I'm not going to go into the whole part of, the convention, and the conventions are looked at, read, as you all know, and are being amplified every couple of years. But what I find really interesting is the emergence of the term well-being quite a bit. That, these are areas that help define the well-being of a society. I would like to know, do you really talk about that? And secondly, I've always found, although some of the conventions and rules are really remarkable, who's defining them? Who's being able to support them? Is it a small coterie of people within a government? How do you get that sweep where the people who are actually the practitioners of a culture, where it is part of their intrinsic cultural heritage, how do you create a system? And by this also saying you create a system, again, is very awkward. But how to bring in the people who are most involved in this culture, and it's good for their preservation. It's what they deem part of their preservation. I'd like to bring up one other point, and this is sort of for Shiv, you know. I did quite a bit of work in Mali, in the traditional medicine, and it is one of the few countries that has a ministry of traditional medicine. So this is something that was terribly opposed by the traditional practitioners for a couple of reasons. One was that it was in a way considered an attack on the lineages of the doctor. Secondly was that there was mass cultivation of medicinal plants. Now we're finding out now the argument of the traditional practitioners is pretty valid, that these plants have to grow in a symbiotic relationship to each other. So mass producing something like Artemisia is not going to do the same thing as growing it with a couple of other plants. So that's the second part of my question. How does really traditional wisdom come into it? And is it better just to leave things alone than try to preserve?
The joys of technology, yeah? Well, I actually raise a number of issues there. I mean, one is, you know, there's a lot of UN speak in UNESCO, and, you know, the convention you referred to, remember, it was in, I think, 2005, the big UNESCO convention on the preservation of cultural diversity. Yeah? 2005?
Yeah,
Preservation of cultural diversity?
That's
I think it was 2005.
Tangible heritage, 2005.
Yeah. And, you know, I say, obviously these things are largely created through by government representatives, so, you know, ambassadors to UNESCO, whoever's consulted to deal with those questions. You're totally right about this question about the lack of these alternative voices in a lot of the fora in which those kind of things are formulated. And how to overcome that? I mean, this is not only true of someone like UNESCO, I mean, I think it's true of academic discourse as well. Again, if you don't mind a little anecdote, I remember being running, in fact, with one of the organizers of a conference held in Quebec at the University Laval, in which we had a mixture of Native Americans from Canada and US and anthropologists, basically, in the same place. And little incidents arose all of the time when you could see not lack of communication exactly, but something like it taking place. I remember I was sitting next to the man who was recording, and one of the Native American ladies was speaking, and in between passages of her speech, there were long periods of silence. And he was very anxious. He said, what should I do? Should I turn off the recorder? I said, no, this is part of the speech, right? The silence was part of the speech, right? But, you know, you thought he was just going to run out of tape because nothing was happening. He said, no, this is part of the way in which these ideas are being presented to us. And I was speaking to another of the participants who was going to leave slightly early. I said, well, why are you going? You have to hurry back for something. He said, yes. He said, you know, we had the conference in September when it's already getting chilly in Canada. He said, I can hear the moose calling. The moose are coming south. You know, I need to get home because the hunting season is going to start, which again is very hard to explain to anybody according to the conventional models of causality and this kind of stuff. The question is really how to bring these voices in physically, but more important, how to listen to them in a way in which you accept or try to understand what they're trying to say in the terms in which they're trying to present this. So perhaps this is again, this examples of what we want to call it native epistemology. You know, Marshall Salins, the Chicago anthropologist, wrote a famous paper over a decade ago called The Sadness of Sweetness in Current Anthropology, Journal of Current Anthropology, which he basically argued that all knowledges are equal. Western knowledge is simply a local knowledge which, due to other processes of colonialism, of the, the quality of its technology and so on, has become hegemonic. But in principle, it has no greater status than any other kind of knowledge, and that will need to be listened to. The other point was about well-being. I don't know if did I use the word in the book? You just read it. I haven't read it. I wrote it, but I haven't read it since I wrote it. Probably not, but I think it's implicit in the sense that what a lot of people were also talking about this concept is basically good life. That what is the point of development? I mean, should we just be left alone, long before any of these ideas about intervening through policy and so on in our lives ever occurred to anybody? If we simply left alone, can we gravitate towards defining and actually creating what we consider to be a good life? I mean, to me, that actually would be a good definition of development, or at least the aims of development would be to create that good life. But it would have to be defined, obviously, by people in their individual terms. There's no necessarily universal version of what that would look like.
My question is both to Shiv and to John. What you told me about the...
Hold the mic closer to your speech. Can you bring it closer?
Oh, okay. So what you told me about the epistemological paradigms, it reminded me strongly about Paul Feyerabend and epistemological anarchism, with his claim that actually all paradigms are incompatible and therefore every epistemological paradigm has equal rights. Because they are all equally probable and have equal justifiability, and it seems to me actually a great idea to bring it in a cultural discourse, in a multicultural discourse, as a way to protect the cultural rights of alternative thinking, because indeed science, Western science, becomes kind of dictatorship, epistemic dictatorship, which comes with the only one right paradigm and exterminates the others. This is a question. So, what do you think of epistemological anarchism as approach?
Feyerabend was not as anarchist as he thought. And Paul Feyerabend was not as anarchist as he thought. I mean, after all, here's a man who actually came all the way to study with Wittgenstein and had the unfortunate reality of studying with Karl Popper. But I think what you have to understand is what you suggested was actually done by Feyerabend's girlfriend, Grazia Borini. If you look at the debates on energy systems, she moved for this. And in fact, out of that has come two concepts which people are working. One is epistemic brokerage. How do you mediate between these guys? And I think that work is now being developed. And in India now, next to the right to information, we are developing the new knowledge panchayats with Aruna Roy. I can send you a paper in a few days, right? Where we look at epistemic brokerage. But even the question of the kind of medical systems Catherine was talking about, you allow for different cultures of development. Because to a certain extent, if you believe the medicine encapsulates a certain embodiment of knowledge, you acknowledge it. But this idea of the knowledge panchayat is now trying to work this out. So it could be quite interesting if you want to get back to it. But this goes back to something else which was developed, which is the following Michael Polanyi's work. What in the Indian movement have developed is an idea of the tacit constitution. The formal constitution of rights is full of silences and holes. So can I connect one of the experiments, a sensorium to a constitution, which will give you a different idea of the rights to the body. Because otherwise the body is a black hole. So I have paper on that. If you want, you can have a look at it. All this is a part of the new work we're doing, social movements and groups. And it's quite interesting the kind of things. If you're interested, I think. Yeah.
Can I just respond briefly too, because we have a few more minutes, right? Not to answer your question directly, but to think of implications. I mean, Tanya and I have been having conversations recently about Buddhism, which is a common interest. And again, I have a as yet unpublished paper, but it's hopefully coming out soon, on what would a Buddhist social science look like if you begin to question certain fundamental assumptions about nature of the self, you know, all those things apply. And of course, again, it would be an example possibly of a radically alternative view of what a social science, if you want to keep that word at all, would look like as a result of that. So I think, I mean, an example like health is a good one because it's fairly obvious that you see this operating very quickly when it comes to the relationship between culture and health systems, right? But I would like to see also this idea expanded in a lot. And one of the ideas I've pursued for some years a little bit too is economics. Now there is a view going around, promoted by a number of economic anthropologists, that what passes as neoclassical economics is what one people in one interesting book have simply called virtualism or virtual economics. So it does not describe the real world. Neoclassical economics does not describe the real world. What it does is create a model through which we believe we understand the real world. Do I make sense? And that's quite different. So one of the ways of critiquing classical economic thinking, conventional economic thinking, is in beginning, in fact, to ask those epistemological questions. The implications of that could be massive for thinking about, if you like, alternative economic possibilities. Not as simply kind of utopian, you know, desert island kind of stuff, but as serious alternatives based on, in fact, an analysis of the very nature of the way in which we think about material world exchange and those kind of things.
Okay. Buddhist economics, I'd be very interested in seeing the paper of yours, because I recall a long time back, Schumacher had a book, Small is Beautiful, in which he had a whole chapter on Buddhist economics. And the kind of model he used was Burma, what's called Myanmar now, and the autarkic model and the kind of low-level equilibrium, the kind of deliberate snuffing out of ambition for material advancement. But of course, there was all sorts of other violence that was germinating within that milieu, which came out in the following years. So, I mean, I have kind of mixed feelings about it. But that's not my main question. My main question is, why are you trying to salvage the word development? I mean, I think that Shiv also posed the question in his own way. Because development runs on the implicit logic that more is better. And that, you know, whatever your current state, you can always do with more of everything. And that means that you engage in an extractive relationship with your environment. It has to be like, you know, an exploitative relationship. And economics, in fact, the entire field of development studies has no way of valuing the environment except in the extractive sense. There is no value inherent in nature other than in its exploitation. That is the logic of economics, and that is the logic which feeds into developmental theory. So why do you have to salvage that word development? Right? And sustainable development, particularly, is even speak for a model of development that does not seem to damage things too badly, seems to leave something there. Could be in the museum, could be in situ, but some residue of a pre-existing life form has to be preserved. It's like after the ridge forest in Delhi was destroyed by the malls, a whole series of them, 3 kilometer long building sequence of malls. They said, we'll set up a biodiversity park to kind of mitigate the damage. You know, that kind of logic could be operative behind this term sustainable development. So again, this whole question of point about commensurability between different epistemic systems, brokerage is a very interesting concept that Shiv has just told us about. But there is also an implicit
assertion in Feyerabend that these are by nature incommensurable, and that the only way to preserve democracy is to allow a coexistence of them all. You know, and finally, I don't know how he sees this working out. Perhaps there could be a dialogue going forward. Perhaps one will triumph over the other. You know, probably that's the sense in which Feyerabend said. Shiv says that Feyerabend is an incomplete anarchist because he sees some kind of resolution coming out of it, whether through dialogue or through some other process of synthesis or whatever. So I'm just interested in knowing why try to retrieve that word, sustainable development, or that phrase, sustainable development. Isn't it just best to eject it and to use a term like epistemic democracy or you know, Feyerabend, for instance, insists that for democracy you should have a complete separation of state and science, you know, so that it's a kind of equalization of power. So, isn't there a better term that you could use, especially since it's in your title, right?
I agree with you basically, and I think as was pointed out, part of the book is in fact, while using the word, is an attempt to undermine it in all sorts of ways. But if I called the book, what did you call it, epistemologic democracy or something, who would read it? The problem is, not maybe a few philosophers read it in a mistaken impression that it was about epistemology, right, which is not directly. The point is to open the space in which you can enter that bigger dialogue, that bigger discourse of what is usually called development. Does that make sense? You have to find a way into that language in order to change it. Okay? Well, I mean, I'm perfectly aware of obviously all of the complications that revolve around the nature of the word itself. And, you know, the assumption with now kind of new kinds of neocolonialism or, you know, neoliberal capitalism and all this kind of stuff. I entirely agree with you. Perhaps I just haven't been brave enough yet quite to make that leap into that new term. Whether one you just suggested is the one that would work. People talk about human, again, well-being, of happiness, or trying to find some sort of human index, or they often come back to the word development anyway. I think it's a word that people recognize, so it gets them to open the cover of the book. Then they will find inside something different.
You're giving them false expectations and then demolishing it.
Thank you, John, and the panelists, Dr. Shiv, Krishna Swami. Wonderful session, and thank you all of you for asking very good questions. The book will be available in the library for checking out. John has very kindly agreed to give a copy to us. So would you like to sign this for us?
Should I sign this one?
Yeah, maybe you can sign this one with the open. Yeah.
This one. The honor of the legal screen and the official.
Checked out, you can reserve. Next, we get small copies.
Thank you all for coming. We have arranged tea for you, all of you.